Now we're back to learning CSS. Let us create a drop-down that gets active via a button or that we can access with a button. Basic structure is the same that we've used for our last drop-down tutorial. If you haven't seen it, you'll find it in my CSS playlist. Create a div container class drop-down. It is going to nest everything. We'll create a button inside. Let me just call that drop-down. And if I refresh the page, this is what you should see by default. I give this a class name directly. This is my drop-down button, so let me call it drop button. I think that's descriptive enough. Let me directly add these two classes here in my CSS so that I don't forget, and I check the spelling. So we have our .dropdown class and a .drop button. Now we want to add the drop-down content, and I put that into its own div container. And here I want to simply add a couple of links. Let me give that the class of drop-down minus content. So I add this as a class selector in CSS directly as well. And as I've said, I want to add links to it. I'll give it a placeholder href. Anchor text, I'll make that link 1, 2, 3, something like this. By default, we can see it. And the way we solved that in our last tutorial, we can use it here as well. We simply set the display for our dropdown minus content div container to none. And this should make it vanish, and it does. Let me add 2 more links here. Now how can we make that visible? Well, we know that we hover over the dropdown and then they should be visible. So we use our dropdown minus content right here, and we have to set the display to block then. This will override the none. So we can see this now again, but we only want this to be active when we hover over the drop button right here. So we select the drop button class with the state hover. And in that case, the dropdown minus content class gets the display block. But I've forgotten to add the dot here to make it a class selector. Let me refresh it. And now this works. So this is a simple principle. I've introduced it in the last tutorial. And it works here on buttons as well. Now it's all about styling this properly. To do that, we'll start at our dropdown. So this is the entire div container. Good idea to set the position to relative first and the display to inline minus block. Let's go to our drop button. I want to make it bigger, change up the colors a little bit. Let me use a bluish color in this case. I set the font color to white, add a padding, increase the font size, border none, and let's switch up the cursor. It becomes a pointer when I hover over the button. Let me use something like this, so sky blue and 20 pixels font size. And now we can move on to our drop-down content, which are the 3 links, or technically it's the div container that nests these 3 links. I'll set the position to absolute. I'll add a minimum width. I want to change the background color. But I've used something bluish for the button, so it's a good idea to use something bluish here as well. And I definitely want to have a Z index of 1, as everything else has the Z index of 0 by default. We can ensure that this dropdown will always be on top like this. But before I mix up my background color here, let me check the links so that we can actually make a vertical list of these links. To do that, we'll select the dropdown minus content class and the nested anchor element inside. I'll set the color to black, add some padding. I get rid of the underline via text minus decoration none. And now let me add the display block, and this should make it a list. There you go. Now let's deal with our background colors. So I don't want to use gray. As I've said, I've used a bluish color for the button. So let me make this light blue for the links. I think that's fine. But we definitely want to have a different color when we hover over these links. To do that, we'll select the dropdown minus content class yet again. Anchor elements inside, but only in a hover state. And here we set the background color to maybe sky blue. That should be fine. One more thing that we can add is we want to change the color of the button when we hover over it. But be careful when you do that. I'm going to show you why. Because we have in principle 2 ways to select that. First one would be to just use the .drop button class in its hover state, obviously. And then I change the background color to a simple blue. And it does the job somewhat, but we hover over it and then we leave it for the links and then the color vanishes. We don't want that. We want it to stay bluish even when we hover over the links. And to do that, we must actually select the drop-down class and not the drop button class. So instead of .drop button, we use .dropdown in its hover state, and then we select the .drop button class and give it the background color of blue. So if we do it like this, I can now hover over the dropdown, switch to the links, and the dropdown keeps its blue color. So this is what we want. Try to recode it step by step. I think I've explained everything in detail, but if there are questions, let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.